This weekend, I was able to visit Pentwater, Michigan, a beautiful town on the shores of Lake Michigan. And I was here to give a talk to the Michigan Dunes chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Not only is Pentwater a beautiful lakeside town, it also has a lot of cool history. From its very beginning, Pentwater was made for the lumber mills. In fact, the founders of this town, E.R. Cobb and Andrew Rector, built it specifically for the lumber. In 1853, they built two buildings, a boarding house and a lumber mill. Later, lumber baron Charles Mears built a channel to Lake Michigan from Pentwater Lake and placed his sawmill on its north bank in 1855. A store and boarding house were also built nearby. A few years later, in 1858, Mears established a ferry service across the channel and built a 660-foot-long pier out into Lake Michigan from the north bank of the channel, so that even the largest boat on the lake could haul lumber. The lumber was going to Mears's yards in Chicago, and they would drop off cargo for the villages here as well. Now, if we were to be standing on this spot in 1866, we would have been in the midst of a bustling lumber town. And it's sure bustling now, especially now that the rain has stopped. But back in those days, we would have been seeing 3 sawmills, 2 shingle mills, 1 barrel stave mill, a planing mill, and 1 foundry. Tall stacks of drying lumber covered all available ground, awaiting shipment, while rafts of logs were clustered along the shore. Sawdust-paved streets were choked with the stumps of recently felled pine trees. Obviously, lumber was the principal outgoing cargo during the harbor's most active years from 1865 to 1900. Getting the lumber onto a ship that would take it to market was a tedious and grueling operation. A typical load of lumber might be made up of 7,000 to 8,000 pieces that would be individually put aboard by longshoremen called lumber shovers. What couldn't go into the hold was piled on the deck. Deck loads were often so high that schooners in the lumber trade had a lumber reef to raise the bottom of the sail above the load. Sometimes a vessel was too large to come into the harbor. In that case, the cargo was first loaded onto light barges, then winched out to the vessel that was anchored in Lake Michigan, and finally reloaded piece by piece onto the ship that was probably pitching quite a bit. Timbers destined to become ships' masts were too long to be loaded and had to be towed. According to the Pentwater News, lath and shingles were also shipped, as were cranberries, potatoes, tan bark, and, in 1 year, 26,000 pounds of maple sugar. Perishable goods such as fish and fruit went deep into the hold, where Lake Michigan's cool water could keep them fresh, not unlike a refrigeration system. Including unloading, a round trip took about a week. However, in August of 1881, the local schooner Dan 1 Davis set a round-trip record of 36 hours to Milwaukee and back. From the harbor's beginning in 1856, traffic increased until in 1891, 1,140 vessels carrying freight and passengers visited Pentwater. At first, masts and sails dominated the harbor scene as small, 50 to 150-ton schooners and sailing scows hauled away the large quantities of white pine from local mills. At one time, the newspaper reported 20 vessels in the harbor waiting for cargo. Of the few steam vessels, Mears's flagship, the propeller-driven C. Mears, was the most welcome visitor, bringing, among other things, timely news of the Civil War. As the stream of lumber slowed to a trickle, sails became fewer in the harbor and steamboats became larger. Vessels such as the Kansas brought summer visitors to the Sands and Maxwell Pier to be greeted by the village band. By the early 1900s, commercial vessels ceased to visit, and by 1905, fire had destroyed the mills, and with gradual depletion of the area forest, only the Sands and Maxwell sawmill and the Halstead Table Factory remained of the lumber-related industries. After completing their sawing in 1905, the Sands and Maxwell sawmill was closed, and in the spring of 1913, it was unfortunately turned down. This ended the lumber era in Pentwater. There was still shipping in the area. Unfortunately, the most disastrous day in the history of Lake Michigan, shipping, happened right off these shores. On November 11, 1940, Armistice Day, now called Veterans Day. On that day, There were 75-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves. A raging storm had broken out. The tempest destroyed 3 ships and claimed the lives of 59 seamen. 2 freighters sank with all hands lost. The William B. Davik, which had 33 hands, and the Anna C. Minch, which had 24 lives lost on board. A third ship, the Novadoc, ran aground with the loss of 2 crew members. Bodies washed ashore throughout the day. Unfortunately, that wasn't the only part of the tragedy. As night fell, a heavy snowstorm arrived. Rescue efforts by the Coast Guard and local citizens continued for 3 days after the storm. And specifically, 3 Pentwater fishermen were later recognized by the local community and the Canadian government for their bravery in rescuing 17 sailors from the Novadoc. There have been many other shipwrecks on the shores of Pentwater, so many that it's part of what is known as the Graveyard of Ships. This is a 20-mile span of Lake Michigan between Little Point Sable at Silver Lake and Big Point Sable, which is north of Ludington. When you look at shipwrecks in the Great Lakes, there's so much information, it might have to be another video. With winter coming, I'll be staying a lot closer to home for my book tour stops, so I'm open to a lot of suggestions as to topics you would like me to cover. And as always, like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.